What if everything you thought you knew about your life, the people, the promises, the future, was suddenly thrown into question by a face you hadn't seen in over a decade? What if that face, in a moment of absolute shock, was staring back at you, asking the questions you didn't know you needed to answer? A face that looked so much like your own, but was from a past you ran away from. This is the story of a man who spent every Christmas alone, trapped in his gilded cage of success, until one day, the life he had carefully built shattered in an instant. And it all started with a woman who was never supposed to be part of his story, yet would change everything. Come Giant's life was as perfect as it was cold, a reflection of everything he had worked for and nothing he had ever truly wanted. At 33, he was the youngest CEO of Zenith Innovations, a powerhouse that dominated the tech industry, its name synonymous with power, success, and ambition. Every year, his face graced the cover of Forbes Asia, lauded as one of Korea's most eligible bachelors and its brightest entrepreneurial star. But none of that mattered to him, not on Christmas Eve. No, not this year. Not any year. Because the truth was, no matter how many accolades, no matter how many luxury cars or lavish dinners, no matter how many people surrounded him, he had never felt more alone. Alone in the penthouse suite of a building that rose high above the city of Seoul, its lights twinkling like 1,000 promises he had never kept. Alone with a glass of whiskey in hand and the cold silence of a world that had forgotten him. He hated Christmas, hated the way it reminded him of everything he had lost, of the promises he had made, of the people he had betrayed, of the family he had turned his back on. Every year, it was the same, his mother calling with that controlled tone, asking if he would join her for dinner. Every year, he declined, the familiar excuse of work hanging on his lips like a well-rehearsed script. His engagement to Sujin was another piece of the charade, a carefully orchestrated affair that suited his family's vision, even if it didn't fit his heart. His heart, if it was still capable of such things, was buried in a memory he refused to face, a memory of a woman he had loved deeply and a daughter he had never known. Adai's. The name echoed in his mind, but it no longer stirred the warmth it once did. No, it was a name now tangled in regret, in unspoken words, in an abandonment that he had convinced himself was necessary for his future. She had been his equal in those fleeting moments of youth, full of ambition, full of dreams. But when things got hard, when the pressure from his family became too overwhelming, he had done what they asked. He had let her go. And in doing so, he had destroyed any chance at a future with her and, unknowingly, with his child. A child he had never seen, never touched, never even spoken to. A child who, he had been told, was better off without him. The sound of the elevator opening in the lobby of Zenith Innovations snapped him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock on the wall, but it was meaningless now. What was the point of knowing the time when it was always the same, an endless loop of work and more work, followed by a long, lonely night? He took another sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid burning as it slid down his throat. But this Christmas, something was different. A woman stepped into the lobby of Zenith Innovations, her presence both unexpected and magnetic. Adai's. The last person he thought he would ever see again. She walked through the glass doors, holding her daughter's hand, a small child with cornrows and a familiar face, his face. The resemblance was undeniable. His heart skipped a beat, a mix of shock and something darker, something buried deep inside him, rising to the surface. How could this be? Was this a dream? A nightmare? Adai's eyes met his across the marble floor, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. He couldn't breathe. His phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the ground. The lobby fell silent, the hum of the building disappearing in an instant. People stared, their eyes flicking between him and the woman who had once been his world. And then, the child, his daughter, looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes and said, "Father." It wasn't just a word. It was a declaration, a challenge, a demand. And everything Giant had built, his empire, his career, his engagement to Sujin, the perfect life he had created to escape the past, collapsed in that single moment. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't understand what was happening, except that his life was never going to be the same again. And so, as the reality of his daughter's presence began to sink in, Jayan found himself standing in the lobby of his own building, a man who had everything yet was now completely lost. His daughter had come to claim him, but could he ever be the father she needed? The conference room was a cold, clinical space, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of Seoul's skyline, a city that, for Jayan, had come to represent everything he had achieved and nothing he had ever desired. He sat at the head of the sleek, glass table, fingers tapping restlessly against the surface. His mind, however, was far from the meeting in front of him. His thoughts were consumed with the image of the woman who had just walked into his life, Adai's. He had seen her standing in the lobby of Zenith Innovations, holding Era's hand, looking every bit like she belonged there, her dark skin in stark contrast to the sterile white walls around them. But it wasn't just her appearance that had caught Jayan off guard. It was the weight of the moment, the gravity of a past he thought he had buried coming rushing back in a way he never could have prepared for. It wasn't just a coincidence that they were standing in front of him. It was deliberate. Era, the child who had been hidden from him, the child he had never known existed until now, had come to confront him, to claim the father who had never claimed her. And standing beside her was Adai's, calm and composed, like a woman who had learned to navigate a world that had repeatedly told her she didn't belong. Jayan took a deep breath as he glanced at the large, ornate clock in the room. Every tick of the seconds felt like a countdown, a reminder of how much time he had lost. How many years had passed since that cold night in London, when he had left her? How many Christmases had he spent alone, thinking of a life he could have had? How many nights had he told himself it didn't matter? But now here she was. Adai's was no longer the young woman who had once shared his dreams. She was someone else entirely, someone who had raised his daughter without him, someone who had lived a life he was not a part of. And yet, in the midst of everything, there was a sense of quiet strength in her, a sense of purpose that he hadn't seen before. It was clear that she wasn't there to settle scores or seek revenge. No, she was there for Era, for her daughter, who had every right to know her father. Father, Era had said, her voice small but steady, her eyes meeting Jayan's with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She had bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that felt out of place in the sterile corporate environment. She spoke flawless Korean, a language Jayan had assumed she wouldn't know, a language that made the situation feel even more surreal. She's been prepared, Jayan thought. Prepared for this moment. Era continued, I've been waiting to meet you. Jayan's heart ached. He wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that he was sorry, to make all the wrongs he had done right. But the words stuck in his throat. The sight of her, standing there in front of him, was overwhelming. She looked so much like him, yet she was a stranger. Her features, sharp and strong, mirrored his own. She had his eyes, his jawline. She was his daughter, and yet, she felt like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Adai's didn't give him a chance to speak. Her presence was commanding without being demanding. She stood tall, a mother who had been through too much to back down now. Her voice was steady, calm, but there was a quiet steel to it as she said, We're here to see CEO Kang Jayan. Tell him A.D. Okono is here. He'll want to see us. The receptionist, who had been smiling at the thought of a high-powered executive meeting, faltered at the mention of her name. She glanced nervously at Era, who was still holding Adai's hand, her eyes fixed on Jayan as if waiting for him to respond. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the receptionist finally relented and called up to the CEO's office. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity for Jayan, a slow march to the inevitable confrontation he wasn't ready for. His mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. He thought about the last time he had seen Adai's, the way she had looked at him with betrayal in her eyes, the last words they had exchanged, the promises he had broken. He thought about his mother's cold dismissal of her, about the shame he had carried for years. But most of all, Jayan thought about Era, the child he had never known, the daughter who had grown up without him and who had come to this building today to meet him. The elevator doors finally opened, and Jayan's gaze snapped to the figure who stepped out, still holding his phone in one hand as he spoke in rapid Korean to someone on the other end. He hadn't been prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for the emotions flooding through him at the sight of Adai's again, of Era, standing beside her, her gaze unwavering. As soon as Era saw him, the confusion in her eyes was replaced by something else, something more mature, more knowing. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment all her life, and now that it had arrived, she was determined to face it with the strength she had inherited from her mother. She bowed again, this time more formally, before speaking in flawless Korean. "Hello, father. My name is Kong Era. I'm 10 years old. I've been waiting to meet you." Her words were a blow to his chest, and Jayan's breath caught in his throat. His phone slipped from his hand, crashing to the floor, but he didn't move. His mind, flooded with the weight of everything he had avoided for so many years, struggled to catch up with the reality standing before him. The room seemed to close in around him as he watched his daughter, a child who looked so much like him, yet had grown up without him. He could barely comprehend the words that followed, the conversation between him and Adai's of the years spent apart, of the lies and the secrets that had kept them apart. He couldn't help but feel ashamed of what had been done, the choice he had made all those years ago. And yet, in the face of it all, it was clear that he couldn't undo the past. The question was, could he be the father Era needed him to be now? Or had he waited too long, standing in the shadows of his own regrets? The days that followed were a blur of tense meetings, unexpected conversations, and realizations that came too late. Jayan had never expected his life to change so drastically, so quickly. One moment, he was the invincible CEO of Zenith Innovations, a man who had everything except the one thing that truly mattered. The next, he was facing a daughter he had never known, a woman who had raised her alone, and a family that had been torn apart by pride and miscommunication. Adai's had made it clear from the beginning, this wasn't just about the past. This was about Era, and it was about the future. She wasn't interested in playing games or negotiating with Jayan's family, who had treated her and Era like burdens for so many years. She had moved on long ago. But Era, her daughter, deserved answers. She deserved a father who would show up, not just in title but in action. And that's where Jayan found himself, trapped between the family he had always known and the one he never realized he needed. The weight of it all seemed to crush him on some days. His mother's phone calls became more insistent, trying to convince him that it was all a mistake, that Era didn't belong in their world, that she would only bring shame to the family. But Jayan had heard enough. He had spent far too many years listening to the voices of others telling him what he should be, who he should love, and what his life should look like. And now, for the first time, Jayan listened to his own voice, the quiet, distant echo of the man he used to be. He listened to the part of him that still cared, still felt the weight of responsibility for a child he had abandoned. But now, in this moment of clarity, he also realized something else. It wasn't just about being a father to Era. It was about becoming a better man, one who could face his mistakes, accept his wrongs, and try, for once, to make things right. Jayan's decision to step away from the life his mother had built for him was as shocking to the outside world as it was to him. But he couldn't go back. Not now. Not when he had the chance to do better for Era, to build something real with her and Adai's. His resignation from Zenith Innovations sent shockwaves through the business world, but inside, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He was no longer chasing an image of success that had never been his. Now he was chasing something more important, a chance at redemption, a chance at healing. Adai's, though still cautious and wary of him, saw the sincerity in his actions. It wasn't about proving anything to her, it was about proving to himself that he could be the man Era needed him to be. And slowly, as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Jayan began to show up. Not just with promises, but with action. He attended Era's school performances, took her to soccer practice, and spent weekends with her, learning the small things about her, the way she smiled when she mastered a new math problem, the way she liked to curl up with a book before bed. The way her laugh could light up even the darkest room. For the first time, Giant understood the kind of love he had been missing all these years. It wasn't perfect. There were still difficult moments, still the heavy shadow of his mother's judgment lingering, still the complicated relationship with his own past. But for the first time, it felt real. The relationship between Giant and Adais was slow to develop. There was no sudden, dramatic reconciliation. Instead, they found a quiet understanding, a mutual respect for the journey they had both been on, and the sacrifices they had made. Adais didn't need Giant to be perfect. She didn't need him to erase the past. But she needed him to show up, to be present in Era's life, and to be the kind of father Era deserved. And he did. It was on a rainy afternoon, months later, that Giant found himself sitting in a small cafe in Hongdae, his fingers nervously twirling a coffee cup. Across from him sat Adais, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But there was something softer in her eyes now, a willingness to consider what the future could hold. He had apologized 1,000 times, but it had taken 1,000 actions to show her that he was serious about making things right. "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" Giant asked quietly, staring into his cup. Adais looked at him, her gaze steady, but with a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "She already has." Giant exhaled slowly, a weight lifting off his chest. He glanced out the window at Era, who was sitting nearby with the book in her lap, her head bent in concentration. For the first time in his life, Giant understood what it meant to be a father, to be present, to be a family. And as they walked out of the cafe together, the future uncertain but full of possibility, Giant took a deep breath. He wasn't just the CEO anymore. He wasn't the man defined by his career or his family's expectations. He was a father. And that, more than anything else, was the redemption he had been searching for all these years. In the end, redemption wasn't about fixing the past, it was about building something new, something stronger, something that could survive the mistakes and the heartache. And for Giant, that was a new beginning.